Welcome to the THOR Table of Knowledge podcast, where we dive deep into the groundbreaking world of trauma care, hemostasis, and oxygenation research. A special thank you to our sponsor, Velico, for their support. Velico is revolutionizing trauma care with their innovative frontline ODP spray-dried plasma system, with the goal of empowering blood centers worldwide to produce dried plasma for transfusions.
We're here today with Dr. Kevin Ward, who is the director of the Weill Institute at the University of Michigan. He's also in the U.S. Army Reserves. So, Kevin, it's a pleasure to meet with you today and talk about some of your passions. I know one of your passions is a saying that has become very synonymous with you, and that is, it's even on your shirt. You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own physiology. Just give us the background on where that came from and why you are spreading that around the world.
Sure. And again, thanks for having me here. The saying, actually, I can only take credit for modifying it. It's a saying from Patrick Moynihan, the late, great senator from New York who served as Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the UN. And his saying was, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own set of facts. And so as I joined THOR, and I'm a physiologist by training before I went to medical school, developed this sort of passion and interest in viewing blood as an organ system. And like other organ systems that can fail, blood can fail. And so we've talked about this concept of blood failure, and I'll be talking about oxygen debt and blood failure. But I got challenged on this concept by people in the community, intensivists, trauma surgeons, emergency physicians, who you would think would understand this. I mean, oxygen debt is a concept developed by Arthur Guyton long time ago. Like, we're almost 100 years into this concept, and it's sort of Guytonian, like Newtonian. And so as I argued this point, the naysayers, I thought, were sort of living in a different reality. And so I said, okay, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you can have your own set of physiology, because we've known about this physiology for years and years.
Right. They must have an opinion on that, though.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, some things are immutable for this. And so this is really, we're going to, on Wednesday, go back through some of the history and why this makes sense, and the accumulation of oxygen debt or whole body ischemia is really the genesis for blood failure and should drive therapies like whole blood. So similar to our, what THOR has done in terms of invigorating the use of whole blood, we sort of fast forwarded to the past, doing things now that we did decades and decades and decades ago. That concept's also driven by physiology that we've known about for nearly 100 years.
Right. So dive a little bit deeper into oxygen debt.
Yeah.
What is it, and why should we care about it?
Yeah, so oxygen debt is this concept that we're currently consuming oxygen at a rate right now. And as we lose blood, I mean, there are lots of different forms of shock. We're going to talk about hemorrhagic and traumatic shock is the sort of the big driving force for THOR. And as you lose blood and you develop shock is sort of defined as when we transition from aerobic physiology and metabolism to anaerobic. And so tissues no longer get the amount of oxygen they need. And when you make that transition, which we call critical oxygen delivery, we go into anaerobic metabolism, which is really ischemia. So when you think about this, when this happens to your brain, we call it stroke. When it happens to your heart, we call it a heart attack or an MI. When it happens to your whole body, we call it shock. And so this is all about, oxygen debt is all about the depth of shock. And similar to sleep, a good way to think about it is sleep. You cannot go a whole week without sleep and then sleep one day and be back at your baseline. It usually takes you days and days and days to recover. So the issue with oxygen debt and debt repayment is that you develop this debt, which is really the depth of ischemia of your whole body, and that ischemia is coming from lots of different organs. We've got to repay that debt, and otherwise, if we don't do that, we suffer the consequences. So we develop organ failure. And so it's a really simple concept. It may, when people hear about it, it's an, oh, yeah, I remember that maybe in medical school or in a textbook. But knowing this as you're looking at your patient and following your patient through, it becomes a really difficult concept to practice. Because despite the classic physiology, we don't have the tools to monitor it. I can't tell you how deep you are in your debt. I can't tell to any degree if I've repaid your debt. And so we have challenges with that. I mean, challenges with permissive hypotension, for example. So how does that factor in?
Right. So where are we with product development for sensors, transcutaneous, hopefully, that can actually quantify oxygen debt? Because we can get a snapshot in time.
Right.
With some markers that might somewhat reflect oxygen debt, lactate, for example, knowing it's not perfect, but it doesn't quantify how long you've been in shock and quantify the oxygen debt. So where are we?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we're not anywhere near where we need to be. So lactate's a great surrogate. Other markers of tissue acidemia are great surrogates for depth. The problem is when we start to treat and then you go back, you hemorrhage some more, keeping track of that continuously to build models. So we don't have a continuous lactate monitor. If we had a continuous lactate monitor, that would be very, very helpful. And debt repayment is dependent in some part on how fast you can repay. So certainly the advent of whole blood helps make that easier. If I had to repay all your debt trying to do crystalloid, I would get into a vicious cycle. But other markers like surrogate markers, like you mentioned, tissue carbon dioxide, it's been around for a long time. The problem is trying to convince industry to come around and do something and this is all falls under the umbrella of precision medicine or precision health. It's funny, if I take 10 super healthy warfighters and I hemorrhage them all the same amount, cc's per kilogram, their debt is going to be all over the place. And their ability to compensate will be different. So I can't choose one number. I've got to have something continuously to measure to drive it for you. And as we start to push whole blood as a very, very precious resource, you don't want to underutilize it and you don't want to overutilize it.
Right.
So we really do need better monitoring technologies without a doubt to drive this concept home.
Yeah, so interesting. And, both you and I will typically focus on improving the O2 delivery side of this equation. But for me, a fascinating aspect is to think about the back end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or how to reduce oxygen consumption to minimize debt. Where are we, do you think, in drug development when it comes to what people call anti-shock drugs?
Yeah, again, this not as far as we need to be. And this is not a new concept. We have sort of talked about hibernation for a long time, suspended animation. I trained at the University of Pittsburgh where Peter Saffer was bringing up suspended animation, a real pioneer in that area.
So for the audience who don't know, what is suspended animation? It's not a Disney movie.
Yeah, that's...
So what do you mean?
So suspended animation is where I could turn your metabolism off, but you would not develop any more complications to that. So if you're hemorrhaging, I could just make your cells go to sleep so they don't suffer any more damage, and then move you to a point where I can start treating you and reanimate you. So whether you call it suspended animation or you call it hibernation, this is a concept we're going to have to make tremendous investment in because, as we move to LISCO now, we don't, transport times are likely to get longer. We're going to keep you in the field longer.
What does LISCO again for the audience?
Large-scale combat operation.
Thank you.
Okay. That this is going to be an increasingly important concept. And we see it in the movies a lot, like in space travel and things like that, where you're put to sleep and then you travel light years and you're just good. But there is a physiologic and cellular basis for this. It's just things that we've tried haven't worked, but we need to go back and make investments. I think now with computational drug design and those sorts of tools, which we didn't previously have access to, that is going to become more of a reality.
Right. Hypothermia?
Hypothermia, I think, has a role in this. But you've got to look at these things in relationship to the concept of oxygen debt. So traditionally, we become hypothermic when we're in shock. That's bad hypothermia because you're not delivering oxygen, you're not making ATP, you're not breaking down bonds, you can't produce heat. But as I perfuse you more and get your perfusion sort of normalized, I think there's a great role for hypothermia to bring consumption down so that any degree of delivery is going to repay back your debt at a lower level of consumption.
So, final question, what else should we be focusing on as a community to improve outcomes for patients with either traumatic hemorrhagic shock or hemorrhagic shock from any etiology?
Yeah. So all sorts of shock, they all obey these Guytonian laws of critical oxygen delivery. Education is a big thing. I mean, we just don't educate providers who are in a position to affect change, use blood products, use monitoring the way we should. So we'll go over the what I call the curve of life, which is this biphasic relationship between delivery and consumption. And when I approach patients, I say, where are they on the curve of life and what do I need to do to move that curve in a favorable direction? So even if we had great tools, it still comes down to education, why we need tools, how to use them, change that question, can I, should I, but again, driving it to physiology. So again, opinions can matter, but only if they're based on a common physiology.
Gotcha. Great. Well, this was a fascinating chat. Thank you for coming and speaking at the THOR Table of Knowledge. And
pleasure.
Skål.
Skål.
That's a wrap for this episode of the THOR Table of Knowledge podcast. A big thank you to our sponsor, Velico, for supporting the advancement of trauma care. Their frontline ODP spray-dried plasma system is paving the way for blood centers globally to produce potentially life-saving plasma for transfusions. Check out our website, www.thornetwork.com, for more podcasts, and join us next time as we continue to explore the cutting-edge science of trauma, hemostasis, and oxygenation. Until then, stay safe and stay informed.